All right, we're about to read chapter 4 of Living with Art, 11th edition by Mark Getlein. Um, it's on the visual elements, and one of the reasons that I am reading this is because I know that it's hard for some people to read. Not that you can't read, not that you're unable, it's just hard to make time for it. Um, Especially, a big old book like this that you're not real interested in. So I get it. It's all right. One of the reasons I'm reading it also is because I don't feel like there is any smaller amount of information that you can get and still comprehend why you should appreciate art. And so I wanted to just do this service. I hope that you enjoy this. I know that I'm not the best reader in the world, but thanks for hanging on there and disciplining yourself to learn more about art. And furthermore, all of the questions on all of the quizzes come from the text. So by reading it, I don't miss anything. So here we go. The visual elements. At first glance, Elizabeth Murray's The Sun and Moon looks like nothing so much as a controlled explosion of colorful jigsaw puzzle pieces. As we look longer, some of the pieces come into focus. There is a pink and red figure, a person stepping over. Stepping over. Is it an orange cat? We can't make out the cat's two ears, its open mouth with a representation of sound coming out as in a cartoon, and its long curling tail which laces through. Is it a window frame? Other elements are less clear, though by now we suspect that they too must represent abstractions of sights and sounds. Murray's paintings strike a clever balance between what we see in abstract terms, an orange shape, and what we eventually realize is represented, a cat. But shapes are not the only thing that our eyes take in as we try to make sense of the painting. We distinguish the colors and notice their range from pale yellow to dark violet. We notice that the shapes are edged in lines and that some lines inside the shapes seem to suggest texture, as in the blue-green lattice formation in the upper right, which may represent pieces of wood. We see that certain shapes repeat, though not regularly enough to form a pattern. We notice the spaces between the pieces of the painting, and we observe that light from above has caused the pieces of the painting to cast shadows, suggesting that they have some mass, like a shallow sculpture. The 8 terms that helped us analyze our visual experience in Murray's painting, line, shape, mass, light, color, texture, pattern, and space, are the ingredients that an artist has available in making any work of art. Called the visual elements, they are the elements that we perceive and respond to when we look at a work's form. During the 20th century, time and motion were added to the traditional list of elements by artists seeking to expand and modernize artistic practice, and this chapter considers them as well. Line. Strictly defined, a line is a path traced by a moving point. You pose your pencil on a sheet of paper and move its point along the surface to make a line. When you sit down to write a letter or take out your date book to jot down a note to yourself, you are making lines. Lines are the symbols of sounds. Artists, too, use lines as symbols. Keith Haring used thickly brushed green lines to portray a winged mermaid appearing miraculously before an appreciative dolphin. The wavy lines that indicate spiritual energy radiating from the apparition's head are clearly symbolic. But in fact, all the lines in the drawing are symbolic. The mermaid, for example, is drawn with a green line, but in reality there is no line separating a body from the air around it. Rather, such lines are symbols of perception. Our mind detaches as a figure from everything around it by perceiving a boundary between one region and another. In drawing, we indicate that boundary with a line. Lines can be expressive in themselves. Sarah C's installation Hidden Relief prominently features lines that draw curves, circles, rules, and lattice formations in the air. Sees assembles her work from commonplace industrial products such as measuring sticks, string, lamps, ladders, toothpicks, plastic tubes, and kitchen implements. In her hands, we become aware of them as visual elements. Bits of ready-made line, mass, color, and shape. The squat blue cylindrical forms here are plastic bottle caps. The white circles are slices of styrofoam cups. Installed in a corner of a room, hidden relief is not particularly large, but C's close-up photograph makes it seem like a universe. Our eyes follow the roller coaster ride of the yellow arcs, spin like figure skaters through the flock of white circles, and speed down the taut string lines that converge on the yellow lamp as we explore this strange new world. The ways that Herring and C's usually use line to record the borders of form and convey direction and motion are the primary functions of line in art. We look more closely at them below. Contour and outline. Strictly speaking, an outline defines a two-dimensional shape. For example, drawing with chalk on a blackboard, you might outline the shape of your home state. On a dress pattern, dotted lines outline the shapes of the various pieces. But if you were to make the dress and then draw someone wearing it, you would be drawing the dress's contours. Contours are the boundaries we perceive of three-dimensional forms, and contour lines are the lines we draw to record those boundaries. Jennifer Pastor used pencil to make a contour drawing of a cowboy riding a bull at a rodeo, one of a series of drawings that record the entire ride from beginning to end. Her confident, even lines capture the contours so skillfully that they suggest fully rounded forms. Direction and movement. In following the looping lines of Sarah C's hidden relief, we were doing what comes naturally. Our eyes tend to follow lines to see where they are going. Like a train following a track, artists can use this tendency to direct our eyes around an image to suggest movement. Directional lines play an important role in Henry Cartier-Bresson's photograph of a small Italian town. For Cartier-Bresson, the success of a photograph hinged on what he called the decisive moment. Here, for example, what probably drew his attention was the woman climbing the stairs and balancing a tray of bread on her head. The small loaves resemble the paving stones so closely that it looks like though a piece of the street were suddenly in motion. Visual coincidences like this delighted Cartier-Bresson, but the decisive moment for the photograph occurred just as the woman was framed by the lines of the iron archway, creating a picture within a picture. Our eyes slide down the line of the steeply pitched railing right to her. Other railing lines carry our eyes into the background, where a cluster of town dwellers stand in the open square. Without the lines of the iron railings, excuse me, our eyes would not move so efficiently through the picture, and we might miss what Cartier-Bresson wants us to notice. You may have remarked that the lines our eyes followed most readily were diagonal lines. Most of us have instinctive reactions to the direction of line, which are related to our experience of gravity. Flat, horizontal lines seem placid, like the horizon line or a body in repose. Vertical lines, like those of an upright body or a skyscraper jutting up from the ground, may have an assertive quality. They defy gravity in their upward thrust. But the most dynamic lines are the diagonals, which almost always imply action. Think of a runner hurtling down the track or a skier down the slope. The body leans forward so that only the forward motion keeps it from toppling over. Diagonal lines in art have the same effect. We sense motion because the lines seem unstable. We half expect them to topple over. Thomas Eakins, the Biglan brothers racing, is stabilized by the long, calm horizontal of the distant shore. The two boats in the foreground are set on the gentlest of diagonals, only a hint, but it is enough to convey their motion. More pronounced diagonals are found in the men's arms and oars. In rowing, arms and oars literally provide the power that sets the boat in motion. In Eakins painting, the diagonals provide the visual power. If you place a ruler over the near oar and then slide it slowly upward, you'll see that the treetops to the left and the clouds in the sky repeat this exact diagonal. It is as if the swing of the oar set the entire painting in motion. The subdued diagonals of Eakins paintings perfectly capture the streamlined quality of sculling, in which slender boats knife smoothly and rapidly through the calm water of a river or lake. Eakins' painting demonstrated that we experience more than literal drawn lines as lines. In fact, we react to any linear form as a line. For example, we can talk about the line of the men's arms or the line of an oar. Oars and arms are not lines, but they are linear. We also react to lines formed by edges. For example, the white contours The white contours of the men's back contrast strongly with the dark behind them, and we perceive the edges of the backs as lines. There is a great contrast in linear movement, and thus in emotional effect between Eakins' work and the next illustration. Theodore Géricault's The Raft of the Medusa. Géricault's work is based on an actual event, the wreck of the French government ship Medusa off North Africa in 1816. Only a few of those on board survived, some by clinging to a raft. Géricault chose to depict the moment when those on the raft sighted a rescue ship. Virtually all the lines in the composition are diagonal. Géricault uses them to create two conflicting centers of interest, thus increasing the tension of the scene. Picked out by the light, the writhing limbs of the survivors carry our eyes upward to the right, where a dark figure silhouetted dramatically against the sky waves his shirt to attract the rescuer's attention. A lone rope, also silhouetted, carries our eyes leftward to the dark form of the sail, where we realize that the wind is not taking the survivors toward their salvation, but away from it. Implied lines. In addition to actual lines, linear forms, and lines formed by edges, our eyes also pick up on lines that are only implied. A common example from everyday life is the dotted line, where a series of dots are spaced closely enough that our mind connects them. The 18th century French painter Jean-Antoine Watteau created a sort of dotted line of amorous couples in the embarkation for Cythera. Starting with the seated couple at the right, our eyes trace a line that curves a gentle S and leaves us evaporating into the gauzy air with the infant cupids. Cythera is the mythological island of love. Watteau specializes in elegant scenes in which aristocratic men and women gather in a leafy setting to play at love. Often, as here, the scenes are tinged with a gentle melancholy. In representational art, the same directional cues we follow in life can create implied lines. When a person stops on the street corner and gazes upward, other passerby will also stop and look up. Following the line of sight, when someone points a finger, we automatically follow the direction of the point. Watteau uses these implied lines here as well. Looking at the painting, we are drawn eventually to the statue of Venus at the far right. We could be stuck there if it were not for the extended arm which directs our attention down to the first couple below, where the winding procession begins. In addition, most of the couples look at each other, but the most prominent gazes are directed to the right, especially that of the woman who turns at the crest of the hill to look at the couple behind her. The graceful procession toward the shore is undercut by the constant tug of backward glances, and in following them, we too are gently pulled back. It is this that gives the painting its slight air of melancholy, prompting many scholars to wonder whether the couples are heading toward the island of love or whether they are leaving it. Shape and mass. A shape is a two-dimensional form. It occupies an area with identifiable boundaries. Boundaries may be created by line, a square outlined in pencil on white paper, a shift in texture, a square of unmowed lawn in the middle of mowed lawn, or a shift in color, blue polka dots on a red shirt. A mass is a three-dimensional form that occupies volume of space. We speak of a mass of clay, the mass of a mountain, the mass of a work of architecture. The volume of space displaced by the masses of Bill Reed's monumental sculpture, The Raven and the First Men, is considerable. Carved from blocks of laminated cedar, the work depicts the birth of humankind as told in the creation stories of the Haida, a people of the Pacific Northwest coast. The giant bird is a spirit hero called Raven. It was he who discovered the first humans hiding in a clamshell and coaxed them out into the world. The photograph of Reed's sculpture shows how light and shadow reveal the three-dimensional form of mass to us, letting us sense where it bulges outward or recedes, where it is concave and where convex. But we cannot fully understand mass from a single two-dimensional representation. We would have to walk around the sculpture in person or have it slowly circled with a video camera to get the complete idea of its form. Unlike the masses of the Raven and the First Men, the subtle, shadowy shapes of Emmy Whitehorse's chanter are fully available to us on the page. A Navajo artist, Whitehorse is inspired in part by the signs and symbols carved centuries ago into the cliffs of her native region. The shapes in chanter seem to appear and disappear into the background. Some are defined by line, others by a shift in color or value. Still other shapes are only implied, partially indicated in a way that encourages our mind to complete them. Shapes and masses can be divided into two broad categories, geometric and organic. Geometric shapes and masses approximate the regular name shapes and volumes of geometry such as square, triangle, circle, cube, pyramid, and sphere. Organic shapes and masses are irregular and evoke the living forms of nature. The masses of Reed's sculpture are organic, whereas Whitehorse used both geometric and organic shapes in her painting. The abstract blue bird at the upper left is organic, for example, and the upside-down house-like shapes outlined in white are at the top right rectangle on triangle are geometric. We perceive shapes by mentally detaching them from their surroundings and recognizing them as distinct and coherent. We refer to this relationship as figure and ground. A figure is the shape we detach and focus on. The ground is the surrounding visual information. The figure stands out from the background. In the photograph of the Raven and the First Men, we easily recognize the sculpture as the principal figure and the rest of the image as the ground. In chanter, on the other hand, things are not always so clear. For example, the dark blue figure of the bird at the upper left detaches clearly from the pale ground, but just below this pale ground turns into a figure as well. Figure and ground shift and interpenetrate across the painting, creating a fluid sense of space and a dreamlike atmosphere. The Aztec feathered shield illustrated next presents us with a further visual puzzle. Made for a military officer as a sign of rank, it can be understood equally well as a light figure on a dark ground or a dark figure on a light ground. If you place a piece of tracing paper over the image and trace the outlines of the light figure, you will find that you have automatically drawn the dark figure as well. In fact, any shape created on a limited two-dimensional surface creates a second complementary shape. This is because the surface is already a shape itself. The shield is a circle. Chanter in the photograph of the Raven and the First Men are rectangles. Any two-dimensional image is thus also a system of interlocking shapes. The shapes we perceive as figures we call positive shapes, and the shapes of the ground are negative shape. In the photograph of Reed's sculpture, for example, negative shapes appear between the bird's wings and its body. Artists learn to pay equal attention to positive and negative shapes in their work, and we will be better viewers for cultivating this habit as well. Implied shapes. Figure 415 shows 3 black circles, each with a wedge taken out. But the very first thing that most of us see is a floating white triangle. Our minds instantly perceive the visual information as a whole, even though that whole doesn't exist. Through optical puzzles such as this, psychology provided a scientific explanation for something that artists had been doing intuitively for centuries, using implied shapes to unify their compositions. In the Madonna of the Meadows, Raphael has grouped the figures of Mary, the young John, the young John the Baptist, and the young Jesus, so that we perceive them as a single triangular whole. Mary's head defines the apex, and John the Baptist the lower left corner. Defining the lower left corner is the lower right corner is Mary's exposed foot, which draws our eye because of the way the pale flesh contrasts with the darker tones around it. If you place a finger over the foot, the implied triangle becomes much less definite, even though it is reinforced by Mary's red and blue robes. Just as an artist uses implied lines to help direct our eyes around a composition, they have used implied shapes to create a sense of order, so that we perceive a work of art as a unified and harmonious whole. Light. To our distant ancestors, light seems so miraculous that the sun was often considered to be a god and the moon a goddess. Today we know that light is a type of radiant energy, and we have learned how to generate it ourselves through electricity. Yet our day-to-day experience of the varying qualities and effects of light is no less marvelous. Doug Wheeler is a contemporary artist whose work increases our awareness of light as a presence in the world. DN SF12 PG VI14 is illustrated here as installed in the atrium of the Palazzo Grassi, a museum in Venice. An atrium is a large interior courtyard open to the sky or roof in glass. The atrium of the Palazzo Grassi is surrounded on all 4 sides by massive stone columns, some of which can be seen in the photograph illustrated here. Others, which should be visible on the other side of the atrium, have vanished, swallowed up by white light. Intellectually, we know that infinity cannot suddenly open up inside of a building, but that is exactly what seems to have happened. Wheeler works his magic with simple means: a continuously curving fiberglass shell painted brilliant white, a smooth white floor, and carefully controlled lighting that eliminates any shadows that would give us visual cues. Reflected from flawless, uninterrupted surfaces, the light takes on a material presence as though we could reach out and touch it. Wheeler's art draws on a childhood spent in the open spaces of the American Southwest. When I was young, I'd have to get up at 4:30 and ride fence line, which was my chore before breakfast. He called it in an interview. The idea was to check different sections of the fence to repair any spots that were compromised, so at first it's dark and you can barely see, and then gradually the light is coming in. The sky was always everything. If there was a couple of scattered cumulus clouds, I found that the clouds created this sense of space, defining space, making it feel dimensional. That's what I started playing with as an artist, not looking at things, but the tension in between things. Wheeler's art is disorienting because it undercuts the most fundamental purpose that light serves for us, which is to reveal the material world to our eyes in a way that helps us understand forms and spatial relationships. In Manuel Alvarez's Bravo, Manuel Alvarez Bravo's photograph, The Visit, we understand something of the texture of the back wall, and the masses of robe sculptures because of the way light and shadow model them or give them a three-dimensional appearance. We cannot see the source of light in the photograph, but we understand from the way the shadows fall that it is off to the right and that the statues are facing almost directly into it. Black and white film has transposed the colors of the original scene into their relative values. Shades of light and dark, for example, we understand that the statues' cloaks are of a darker color than their robes, even though we don't know what the two colors are. Value exists in a seamless continuum from white, the lightest value, to black, the darkest value. For convenience, we often simplify this continuum into a scale, a sequence of equal perceptual steps. The value scale here goes from black to white in 9 steps, including both endpoints. Our eyes are more sensitive than film and can distinguish a greater and more subtle range of values. Nevertheless, thanks to black and white photography, we can readily understand the idea that the world we see in full color can also be expressed in shades of light and dark, and that every color can also be spoken in terms of its value. Photography easily demonstrates how value models mass for our eyes, but photography was invented only in the mid-19th century. Long before then, European painters had become interested in modeling mass in 2 dimensions through value. Discovered and perfected by Italian painters during the Renaissance, the technique is called chiaroscuro, Italian for light-dark. With chiaroscuro, artists employ values, lights and darks to record contrasts of light and shadow in the natural world, contrasts that model mass for our eyes. One of the great masters of chiaroscuro was Leonardo da Vinci. His unfinished drawing of the Virgin and Saint Anne with the Christ Child and John the Baptist shows the miraculous effects he could achieve. Working on a middle value brown paper, Leonardo applied charcoal for a range of darks and white chalk for lighter values. The figures seem to be breathed onto the paper, bathed in a soft, all-over light that comes from everywhere and nowhere. The roundness that Leonardo's mastery conveys is immediately evident if we look between the heads of the two children at the raised hand of Saint Anne, drawn with a contour line but not modeled. It looks jarringly flat, as though it does not yet belong to the rest of the image. Leonardo used continuous tones in his drawing, values that grade evenly into one another. But value can also be indicated by surprising richness by line alone. In the etching shown here, Charles White relied solely on line to model the head of a woman seen in profile. Taking the pale gray of the paper at its highest value, White indicated the next step down in value with hatching. Areas of closely spaced parallel lines on the front of the forehead or the side of the nose. Darker values are achieved through additional sets of parallel lines laid across the first, a technique called cross-hatching. Seen from up close, the effect seems coarse, but at a certain distance, the dark hatch marks seem to average out with the lighter paper into nuanced areas of gray. An effect of perception called optical mixing. Another technique for suggesting value is stippling, in which areas of dots average out through optical mixing into values. As with hatching, the depth of the value depends on the density. The more dots in a given area, the darker it appears. Color. It is probably safe to say that none of the visual elements give us as much pleasure as color. Many people have a favorite color that they are drawn to. They will buy a shirt in that color just for the pleasure of clothing themselves in it, or paint the walls of their room that color for the pleasure of being surrounded by it. Various studies have suggested that color affects a wide range of psychological and even physiological responses. One particular shade of pink, known as Baker-Miller pink, has been shown to calm agitated or aggressive behavior, producing a tranquilizing effect that lasts for about half an hour. In Tokyo, blue lighting installed at the ends of train platforms has been effective in reducing the number of people who attempt suicide by diving in front of the oncoming trains. A recent German study suggests that seeing the color green can boost creativity. The mechanism involved in these color responses is still unclear, but such studies indicate that color affects the human brain and body in powerful ways. Color theory. Much of our present-day color theory can be traced back to experiments made by Sir Isaac Newton, who is better known for his work with the laws of gravity. In 1666, Newton passed a ray of sunlight through a prism, a transparent glass formed with non-parallel sides. He observed that the ray of sunlight broke up or refracted into different colors, which were arranged in the order of the colors of the rainbow. By setting up his second prism, Newton found he could recombine the rainbow colors into white light like the original sunlight. These experiments proved that colors are actually components of light. In fact, all colors are dependent on light, and no object possesses color intrinsically. You may own a red shirt and a blue pen and a purple chair, but those items have no color in and of themselves. What we perceive as color is reflected light rays. When light strikes the red shirt, for example, the shirt absorbs all the color rays except for the red ones, which are reflected so your eyes perceives red. The purple chair reflects the purple rays and absorbs all the others, and so on. Both the physiological activity of the human eye and the science of electromagnetic wavelengths take part in this process. If we take the colors separated out by Newton's prism, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet, add the transitional color, red-violet, which does not exist in the rainbow, and arrange these colors in a circle, we have a color wheel. Different theorists have constructed different color wheels, but the one shown here is fairly standard. Primary colors. Red, yellow, and blue are labeled with the numeral 1 on the color wheel. They are called primary because, theoretically at least, they cannot be made by any mixture of other colors. Secondary colors, orange, green, and violet, are labeled with the numeral 2. Each is made by combining two primary colors. Intermediate colors, also known as tertiary colors, labeled number 3, are the product of a primary color and an adjacent secondary color. For instance, mixing yellow with green yields yellow-green. We speak of the colors on the red-orange side of the wheel as warm colors, perhaps because their association with sunlight and firelight. The colors on the blue-green side are cool colors, again probably because of their association with sky, water, shade, and so on. During the 19th century, many scientific color theories were published, and painters were quick to try to take advantage of their findings. Some painters, for example, stopped using black altogether on the grounds that it was not a color found in the natural spectrum. Impressionist painter Camille Pissarro left us a witty demonstration of what could be accomplished using what he called a spectral palette. Palette refers to the wooden board on which artists traditionally set out their pigments, but it also refers to the range of pigments they select, either for a particular painting or characteristically. Pissarro here gives us both meanings, creating a painting on his wooden palette and leaving the colors he set out to make it around the edge. From the upper right, they are white, yellow, red, violet, blue, and green. Using only these colors and their mixtures, Pissarro painted a delightful landscape of a farmer and his wife with their hay wagon. Color properties. Any color has three properties: hue, value, and intensity. Hue is the name of the color according to the categories of the color. According to the categories of the color wheel: green or red or blue violet. Value refers to relative lightness or darkness. Most colors are recognizable in a full range of values. For instance, we identify as red everything from palest pink to darkest maroon. In addition, all hues have what is known as a normal value. the value at which we expect to find that hue. We think of yellow as a light color and violet as a dark color, for example, even though each has a full range of values. Figure 4.26 shows the hues of the color wheel in relation to a gray value scale, and the hue blue taken through a range of values. A color lighter than the hue's normal value is known as a tint. For example, pink is a tint of red. The color darker than the hue's normal value is called a shade. Maroon is a shade of red. Intensity, also called chroma or saturation, refers to the relative purity of a color. Colors may be pure and saturated as they appear on the color wheel, or they may be dulled and softened to some degree. The purest colors are said to have the highest intensity, duller colors lower intensity. To lower the intensity of a color when mixing paints or dyes, the artist may add a combination of black and white, or may add a little of the color's complement, the hue directly opposite to it on the color wheel. Figure 4.26 shows a saturated yellow-orange, lowered first with gray and then with blue-violet. Light and pigment. Colors behave differently depending on whether an artist is working with light or with pigment. In light, as Newton experiments showed, white is the sum of all colors. People who work directly with light, such as lighting designers who illuminate settings for film, theater, or video productions, learn to mix color by an additive process in which colors of light mix to produce still lighter colors. For example, red and green light mix to produce yellow light. Add blue light to the mix and the result is white. Thus red, green, and blue form the lighting designer's primary triad. Pigments, like any other object in the world, have to our eyes the color that they reflect. A red pigment, for example, absorbs all the colors of the spectrum except red. When pigments of different hues are mixed, and resulting color is darker and duller, because together they absorb still more colors from the spectrum. Mixing pigments is thus known as a subtractive process. The closer two pigments are to being complementary colors on the color wheel, the duller their mixture will appear. For the more they subtract each other from the mix. For example, whereas red and green light mix to produce yellow light, red and green pigment mix to produce a grayish-brown or brownish-gray pigment. Color harmonies. A color harmony, sometimes called a color scheme, is a selective use of two or more colors in a single composition. We tend to think of this especially in relation to interior design. You may say, for instance, the color scheme in my kitchen is blue and green with touches of brown. But color harmonies also apply to pictorial arts, although they may be more difficult to spot because of differences in value and intensity. Monochromatic harmonies are composed of variations on the same hue, often with differences of value and intensity. A painting all in reds, pinks, and maroons would be considered to have a monochromatic harmony. In Bed, Inca Essenhai uses tints and shades of blue to depict a slightly sinister scene in which fiendish sprites tug at a sleeping woman. Complementary harmonies involve colors directly opposite each other on the color wheel, such as red and green. Complementaries react with each other more vividly than with other colors, and thus areas of complementary color placed next to or even near each other make both hues appear more intense. The glow of red gasoline pumps in Hopper's gas, for example, owes much to the presence of the green foliage in the background. The yellow and orange fire in J.M.W. Turner's The Burning of the Houses of Parliament, c. 5.11, would not burn as bright had Turner not depicted the night sky in blue and violet. Claude Monet evoked the brilliance of a summer day by setting an orange roof against the blue sea of the fisherman's cottage on the cliffs at Varengeville. Analogous harmonies combine colors adjacent to one another on the color wheel, as in Diana Cooper's The Sight. which moves from yellow through yellow-orange, orange, and red-orange to red. Triadic harmonies are composed of any three colors equidistant from each other on the color wheel. In his mature works, Pete Mondrian famously limited his colors to the primary triad of red, yellow, and blue. See Trafalgar Square in 21.26. The same triadic harmony in another guise dominates Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, Jupiter and Thetis. Paul Gauguin's Te a no Eros owes a great deal to the triadic harmony of blue-green, red-violet, and yellow-orange, as well as the complementary opposition of blue-green and red-orange. Numerous other color harmonies have been identified and named. Artists themselves, however, are more likely to speak generally of working with a restricted palette or an open palette. Working with a restricted palette, artists limit themselves to a few pigments and their mixtures. Tints and shades for an example of painting created with a restricted palette. Look at John Singleton Copley's Paul Revere in Chapter 17, see 17.20. For an example of a painting created with an open palette, look again at Manohar's Jahangir receives a cup from Khusro in Chapter 1, see 1.8. Optical effects of color. Certain uses and combinations of color can play tricks on our eyes or more accurately on the way we perceive colors registered by our eyes. One effect we have already touched on is simultaneous contrast, where complementary colors also appear more intense when placed side by side. Simultaneous contrast is related to another fascinating optical effect, afterimage. Prolonged staring at any saturated color fatigues the receptors in our eyes, which compensate when allowed to rest by producing the colors complementary as a ghostly afterimage in the mind. You can experience this effect by following the instructions in the caption to figure 4.30. Formulated and popularized during the 19th century, the principle of simultaneous contrast and the optical effect of afterimage were taken into account by artists of the time, especially by the Impressionist painters. Monet, for example, based many of his paintings on complementary paintings, including Fisherman's Cottage on the Cliffs at Varangeville, which we looked at in Chapter 2, see 2.5. More subtly, Impressionist painters tinted the shadows in their paintings with the complementary color of a nearby highlight, thus recording the way the eye, resting by looking at a shadow, colors that shadow by producing an afterimage. In Monet's autumn effect at Argenteuil, see 21.5, the shadows along the bank are tinted blue-green and blue-violet as an afterimage of the yellow-orange and red-orange highlights of the foliage. Some colors seem to advance, others to recede. Interior designers know that if you place a bright red chair in a room, it will seem larger and farther forward than the same chair upholstered in beige or pale blue. Thus, color can dramatically influence our perception of space and size. In general, colors that create the illusion of large size and advancing are those with the warmer hues, red, orange, and yellow, high intensity and dark value, small size, and receding are suggested by colors with cooler hues, blue and green, low intensity and light value. Colors can be mixed in light or pigment, but they can also be mixed by the eye. When the small patches of different colors are close together, the eye may blend them to produce a new color. This is called optical color mixture, and it is an important feature in the painting of George Seurat. Seurat was familiar with the color theories of his day, which seemed to hold out the possibility of placing painting on a scientific footing. Most artists blend their colors either on a palette or on the canvas itself to produce gradations of hue, But Seurat did not. Instead, he laid down his paints by placing many thousands of tiny dots or points of pure color next to each other, a process that came to be called pointillism. From a distance of a few inches, a painting such as Evening Honfleur appears to be nothing but a jumble of colored dots. As the viewer steps back, however, the dots gradually coalesce into shapes, and an image emerges of the shore of Honfleur, a seaside town in France. Seurat's dots never quite fuse entirely. They remain just distinct enough to give the surface of the painting a lively texture, and they create a sort of shimmer as their colors interact. In a letter he sent from Honfleur to his friends, the painter Paul Signac, Seurat spoke of the sea as being an almost indefinable gray. His technique of optical mixing is well suited to producing such indefinable colors. Seurat sometimes painted frames for his paintings using the same pointillist technique. Evening Honfleur has one of the few frames to have survived. We can see how Seurat used contrasting values and complementary colors on the frame to make the sky, sea, and sand seem more luminous. Fundamentally blue, it tilts subtly toward violet, green, orange, and red as it makes its way around the painting. Optical mixing is perhaps most familiar to us today through computers, whose screen images are made up of discrete units called pixels, short for picture elements. Most computer users have noticed that enlarging an image eventually causes it to disintegrate into component pixels, which appear as squares of color set in a grid pattern. Reversing the process, we can watch as the pixels grow smaller and the image comes back into focus. In works such as Hendrik's, Devora Sperber explores our brain's capacity for assembling images from discrete units of visual image information by using spools of colored thread as the equivalent of pixels. Just as pixels are digital samplings of an original image, so Sperber's thread colors match crude samplings of a photograph of the musician Jimi Hendrix. Turned upside down, seen from a few feet away in person, the 1,292 spools form a large, gridded, seemingly non-representational composition. If we were to step back far enough, an image would gradually come into focus, but Sperber spares us the trouble of placing a clear acrylic sphere in front of the work. The sphere acts as a lens, gathering in visual information, miniaturizing it, and rotating it 180 degrees. Our eyes work the same way. The illustration in Figure 433 shows how Hendrix's face comes into focus in the viewing sphere, and also how the spools themselves appear from up close. By providing a way for us to see the image and its components at the same time, Sperber makes us aware of the brain's role in constructing our visual reality. Emotional effects of color. Color affects us on such a basic level that few would deny that we have a direct emotional response to it. The problem comes when we try to find a universal principles, for we quickly discover that emotional responses to color are both culturally conditioned and intensely personal. For most people brought up in America, red and green have a strong cultural association with Christmas. Vincent van Gogh, however, once made a painting of a cafe interior that juxtaposed red and green to suggest what he called the terrible passions of humanity. For the German painter Franz Marc, blue was the color of male spirituality. In India, it is associated with Hindu deity Krishna, who is traditionally depicted with blue skin, for sacred texts describe him as being the color of water-filled clouds. As the color of the sky and the ocean, blue is often associated with freedom. It is a cool color and has been shown to have a calming effect. James Abbott McNeill Whistler certainly had a calm in mind when he chose blue for the overall color of his nocturne in blue and gold, except for a distant spangle of fireworks and the reflection of a few lights in the water. The painting is entirely monochromatic, brushed in shades of grayish blue, contributes significantly to the subdued emotional mood of the painting, although it does not create it all alone. The strong, stable vertical lines of the pier, the reassuring horizontals of the bridge and the horizon, the evident tranquility of the scene with its lone boatman silhouetted on the stern of the craft, these elements also play a role in the emotional temperature of the work. Edvard Munch's harrowing painting The Scream also depicts a large bridge, but the effect is much different. It was a time when life had ripped my soul open, Munch wrote in his diary. The sun was going down. It was like a flaming sword of blood. The sky was like blood sliced with strips of fire. I felt a great scream, and I heard, yes, a great scream. The colors in nature broke the lines of nature. The lines and colors vibrated with motion. I painted the picture Scream then. Munch uses red to indicate horror, blood, and anguish. But how outside of his diary are we to know that Munch did not intend simply to depict a splendid sunset, as in Whistler's nocturne? Color does not carry the entire expressive burden by itself, whereas Whistler's painting is characterized by reassuring vertical and horizontal lines. Here, unstable diagonals and swirling lines dominate. The horizontal of the horizon is almost obliterated. The figure in the foreground clasps his hands over his ears to block the piercing sound. His head has become a death's head. His body wavers unsteadily. In contrast, the two pedestrians in the background remain unaffected. Evidently, they hear nothing out of the ordinary. The scream is a silent one, the interior cry of a soul projected onto nature. Alright. I have a hard time uploading big videos, so I'm going to upload this one, and then you can look for a Chapter 4, Part 2.